So we begin by researching and understanding both criminal and animal influences. So for example, based on historical data about criminals, we can make a probability statement such as bodies are often left alongside roads. This serves as a conceptual level probability model. And then we can turn that into a formal statement. For example, there's a higher probability of remains within 100 yards of a road. And then for that formal statement, we can then make an attempt to quantify that. For example, probability of area, or POA, within 100 yards of a road increases by 40%. And then if we have multiple probability statements that follow this path, we can, in the right way, map those areas of higher probability or higher probability density and use that map to provide overall POA or PDEN and help guide our search assignments. And we'll see some examples of this approach. So when planning for criminal evidence searches, and that's sort of the focus of tonight, it's important to consider two key factors that can determine the location of human remains. First, the remains originally are placed somewhere by a human criminal, okay? Secondarily, the remains may be distributed by animals. And so first we'll spend some time looking at the human behavioral factors. And then after that, we'll consider what terrain factors, how to think about the terrain involved. And then we'll end up looking at how we might model what I think of as animal behavioral factors. All right, so a fundamental concept of search planning and of human psychology is that we can use past behavior as a guide to predict future behavior. For example, we know a lot about lost person behavior by assimilating and studying the results of previous searches. Similarly, a lot is known about criminal behavior from studying what has happened in past crimes, and we can apply this knowledge of criminal behavior patterns to plan our search for human remains. So if you review the literature on criminal behavior, you can find some fairly consistent patterns described, okay? Criminals fear discovery. They do not want to be caught in the act. Criminals have physical constraints when moving a body. Typically, bodies are heavy. Most criminals will be looking for a quick and easy location to dispose of a body. For that reason, for example, turnouts, roadside culverts, and sides of roads are higher probability areas. Those of us here in the Pacific Northwest, we know that from past homicide cases, our highways and main roads provide easy access to forest roads in the foothills on both sides of the Cascade Range. And often our evidence searches are out in those, alongside those forest roads. So by pulling together what we know about criminal behavior, it's possible to list factors that can help us answer the question, how likely are we to find remains at this location? And so I've tabled many of those factors here. And note that for each factor, we can translate historical observations into qualitative probability statements. So let's take a look at those. Distance. Probability generally increases with distance from the road or pullout. Probability generally decreases with distance from the road or the pullout. Now there's a variant of that, is that if I'm a criminal and I want to hide a body, I don't want to be too close to the road, but I don't want to carry it too far away to get sort of into the grim details. Slope is a factor. Probability of finding remains is generally higher on the downhill side off a road or a pullout because it's hard work to move uphill. Similarly, the vegetation factor, wooded areas would have a higher probability than open areas in general. All of these are general probability statements. For the visibility factor, probability of finding remains is generally higher for locations that are shielded from being seen. And structure or habitation is a factor. Probability generally decreases near habitations or houses or busy roads, for that example. So we can get even more precise in our modeling. Let's take a look at distance from the road in more detail. So by pulling together what's known about criminal behavior, we can put together a model, and this is admittedly sort of a speculative model. So if we look in Bob Kester's Endangered and Vulnerable Adults and Children Lost Person Behavior Statistics, he shows historical data that indicate that 92% of discarded bodies are found within 150 yards of a road. But we could carry this further because in some cases, we might be able to identify important factors that contribute to how far a specific suspect might travel when attempting to conceal a body. It's not always the case that there is a suspect in mind, but sometimes there is. And in those cases, we would want to consider stamina, initiative, and time available. How strong was the perpetrator? How strongly was the perpetrator motivated? And how much time might have been available to move the body? All of these factors increase the potential distance from the road. So in general, we can look at this model, and this formula incidentally looks very scientific, but I made it up. This is just sort of to formalize our thinking here. And it basically says that as stamina, initiative, and time increase, we might expect that our remains were moved farther from the road. Now, we can get even more detailed, and this is getting a little bit carried away, but I'll show you the kind of thinking you can do. We might start to quantify, or at least rank, the influence of stamina, initiative, and time. And we could do this by simply ranking factors on a low, medium, high scale. So we have a particular case, we have detectives have a suspect in mind, they think they know a general area where he might have hidden a body, and for this particular suspect, we think he had a high degree of stamina and medium levels of initiative and time available. We could then come up with a scoring system for that, which in this example is somewhat arbitrary. But we could then apply that scoring system and make an adjustment of where in the range from close to the road to the farther distance from the road do we think this specific suspect might have left the body. So again, this does not tell us exactly what distance range we're going to find our remains in, but it might give us a model for narrowing it down a little bit. All right, so let's move on now to spend a little bit of time thinking about terrain analysis, which can be very important. And a question just popped up: would it matter if there are multiple perps? That's a really good question, and yes, it would, because I mean, if you if the image comes to mind, it's easier for two people to carry remains or a body than it is for one. So that would be a factor that would increase our distance in our distance consideration, certainly. All right. So let's think a little bit about terrain analysis. Many of the criminal and animal influences on location of remains are in fact affected by terrain. And so for that reason, analysis of search terrain, which can be done both remotely and on scene, and probably should be done both remotely and on scene, can be of huge importance in planning searches for human remains. So let's look at some specific examples here. And so we'll start with a fictitious example. A hunter has found a human cranium out in a wilderness area, and detectives want to see if more remains or bones can be found. So if we look at an aerial map, we can see that the cranium location is sort of near a dirt road, but we really can't see too much else. So we want to do some more detailed analysis. So let's first look at a topographical representation of the same area. And here on a topographical map, we can now see that the cranium is located below the road above a steep slope. Okay, so now we start thinking that more bones may be farther down the slope simply due to the effect of gravity. Let's do some more digging, figuratively speaking. Using our mapping application, we can now examine additional map layers to obtain more information. And here we're looking at the USGS layer, and we can clearly see here that there might be a road or perhaps an abandoned road that leads up to quite close or nearby to where the cranium was found. So this is very interesting. Possibly this was an access path used by the criminal. Okay. Now we're going to switch our base layer to one that more clearly shows streams and drainages. And as we'll learn shortly, an important animal scattering factor is that they tend to use drainages or can move remains into drainages. So it's important in our planning to locate these and add them to our master planning map. We can also use, and we do this, Google Earth to visualize the area in 3D. Here, for example, it makes it easier. It's a little bit hard to see, but it makes it easier to see this large, somewhat forested ravine just to the northwest of the cranium was found. And then also with Google Earth, you can actually, if you know how to do it, and it's a very neat trick, you can actually do a virtual drive-in on the roads that come into the area to get a feel for what it was like driving in, where pullouts were, where you approach the edges of drop-offs, such as right in this area. Okay. The other thing we can do in Google Earth is to look back in time, and we can set the map images to past date, sometimes years and years and years ago. And in this example, we see what might be an example, a clear example of the old road leading here. And so we're doing this analysis in front of our computers at home. We don't really know if this is out there. It's going to be important to scout this on the ground. And then, as I said before, this advanced terrain analysis just using mapping applications is really important, but also it's critical. It's a critical part of terrain analysis to actually get out there and do on-the-ground scouting. Okay, so now let's spend a little bit of time thinking about the effects of animal behavior on the location of human remains. And this can be a hugely important factor, particularly when the remains have been in the wilderness or even rural areas for some time, because animal behavior can make remains extremely difficult to locate. I mean, if you think about it, it's sort of like calling in a specialized team to distribute and hide remains. They're the perfect co-conspirators for the human criminal. Plus, they're typically not very cooperative when questioned. So once again, once our perpetrator has left a body into a natural environment, the animals take over the process. And any remains in the wild, whether animal or human, they sort of become part of the local ecology cycle, and they provide nutrients for all sorts of insects and animals. And in that process, human remains, we know, are transformed and moved. And so a key question is, can we take what's known about animal behavior and turn that also into probability models? And then can we use those probability models to predict where the chance of finding remains is going to be higher? So there was a researcher named Haglund, and he was one of the first investigators to formalize thinking about the impact of scavengers on human remains. And he described the steps needed to carefully examine and understand, or better understand, animal scattering. And I've summarized these here. Okay. The first step is to identify what Haglund called the candidate scavengers. What scavengers might have been there based on animals in the area. Then with a sometimes forensic examination of any found remains, you can determine which scavengers likely were there, and then go on to consider the following concepts that apply to those scavengers. Environmental concepts such as locating trails, dens, nests, ecological concepts such as what time of the year was it, what were they doing? For example, were coyotes feeding their young? And then consider possible transport characteristics or perhaps distances. Which leads to sort of the next set of questions, which we'll get to in a little bit. You know, are the remains scattered? From where was the body scattered, and what are the most likely trajectories of dispersion, which we'll see is an interesting question. Okay. So to all this analysis of animal scattering, it's also important to consider environmental forces, and this is why on the ground scouting is important. So we need to be asking ourselves, how much time do I think has passed? How long have the remains been in the area? What's the weather history been? Are there possible water-induced or snow-induced movements? So for example, snow can move things downhill just by the effect of gravity. Are there possible effects of vegetation? We had one search not too far back where a growing tree had actually carried bones well off of the ground. And so this is one reason we train both humans and canines to search high and low. So here in the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest, we know who our usual animal suspects are. And I do realize this may be quite different from those dialing in from other areas or other countries. But notice here in the Pacific Northwest that our likely subject are among, if you consider lions, tigers, and bears, not tigers and possibly lions and occasionally bears, but very likely coyotes, domestic canines, rodents, and with differing potential impacts. So canines and coyotes may move remains substantial distances, whereas rodents may distribute bits of bone only small distances. Birds, such as ravens or vultures, may in fact distribute small pieces quite widely, which would make them almost impossible to find. And then down to the insect level, which is just sort of micro disassembly of remains. What we'd really like to have is a chart like this with another column that says average distance that this suspect will move remains. That would be really nice to have. Unfortunately, no such table is available. All we have are anecdotal stories. And just a great comment here, also consideration of raptors as well. Yes, vultures, I would include raptors in the birds category here as well, yeah. And since we have osprey and eagles right outside my backyard, I would certainly not want to overlook them. Okay. So again, I think I mentioned earlier, it's important to also understand that the animal scattering interacts with terrain features. So that's why one of our early planning tasks is a careful study of the terrain combined with scouting on site. So as I mentioned, drainages and animal trails can be locations of higher probability. Drainages as well would be features of higher probability. The more open the environment, generally speaking, the wider the possible scattering. But again, it's important to repeat, all of these are general behavioral guides. They don't tell us specifically how the animals move the bones that we're going to be looking for next week. So in our areas, coyotes are one of our favorite suspects for distributing remains. So in planning, it's important to, for example, locate fence lines, roads and trails and drainages, attempt to locate animal trails. This is where trackers might be extremely valuable. So these are the features that we want to be aware of. For example, if you're in a canine, you're out in your assigned area, you may want to pay a little bit of extra attention if you locate animal trails or along fence lines. I'll mention a few years back, we were on an evidence search. We were on our hands and knees alongside a river in a wooded area, literally scraping the ground, looking for additional skeletal remains of a suicide victim. And suddenly from the woods, I mean, not 20 yards from us, a whole pack of coyotes started howling. So we took this as a possible hint that coyotes were active in the area. But we decided that if we didn't bother them, maybe they wouldn't bother us. And that worked out pretty well. All right. Okay, so it's time for another poll. And this is considering past searches that you've been on and whether or not a pattern to how bones were scattered was detected. So let me start this poll here. Finding more bones, yes. Launch poll. Okay, this also is multiple choice. And I see people are responding. So as we're responding to the poll, we have an interesting question here. What causes greater scattering in arid environments? For example, is it predators looking for water? So I think the short answer, at least for me on that, is I don't know. But just off the top of my head, I would say that if a predator coyote, for example, has come upon remains of any kind, I'm thinking it's a reasonable assumption that what's foremost in their motivational mindset is, you know, I'm going to grab a chunk of this and maybe take it away, either back to my pups or back where my other coyote friends aren't going to steal it away from it, away from me. But so that was sort of a weak answer, but it does raise the point of planning may have different considerations in different types of environments, desert versus forested environments here. Okay, so I think we're sharing the results, and let's see what we had. So we had 14 responders, and this is interesting. So 5 out of 14 said that there was sort of random distribution for the central point, and then 9 out of 14 indicated that bones were distributed in one direction. So this is very interesting. I'm going to come back to that in a couple of slides here. In fact, in just the next slide, I guess. Okay. All right. All right, so which is an excellent lead into the very next slide. And as I was researching this topic, I was trying hard to find a clear answer to this question. Are there predictable patterns or shapes of distribution of bones that we could use in predicting where to focus search efforts? In other words, if 1 or 2 bones were found, can we predict the direction in which more might be located? And as you can imagine, this would be a really useful trick. There's not a lot of research available, but I'll try to summarize some of what I found. So the first study is done by Lisa Bright. She did an interesting study in Northern California. This was for her master's degree research. And she placed pig carcasses and game cameras out in the woods, and then studied any scavengers that showed up, and then also went out and measured what happened to the location of the pig remains. And in her study, bears were the main scavengers. Here are 2 suspects caught on the camera. And as you can imagine, they inflicted major modifications on the pig carcasses. But in her study, she reported that she was not able to see any clear geographical patterns to scattering, other than possibly remains dragged in the more densely wooded areas. So in another study, Beck and his team also examined the distribution of pig remains. This was in a desert environment. And so as a model for human remains, 3 pig carcasses were actually dressed in human clothes. This made for some sort of bizarre pictures in the paper. And in this study, the main scavengers were turkey vultures and coyotes. And as you can see in these diagrams, he described what might maybe be a sort of elliptical pattern of distribution of the remains from the original location. This one here on the right, for example, seemed to be sort of stretched in the downhill direction. That would make sense. And then he had another interesting observation, and that was that clothing and other smaller artifacts were actually moved greater distances than the bones were. And as a result, he recommended searching should be extended in at least 100-meter distance. But again, this is based on a very limited number of observations here. So a fellow named Gleason has actually a pretty good paper in which he summarized searching for human remains. And in that, he mentions a couple of studies that also hinted at a possible linear distribution. So we see in this case here, there was sort of an elliptical distribution. In this case here, again, sort of an elliptical distribution. But again, based on a very limited number of studies. So it's hard to know how much we should bet on patterns like this. A very loose interpretation might be, if you find a second bone, consider that a possible indication of a direction of distribution of additional remains. Okay. So now let's see how we can pull some of what we've learned together. What we've learned about search theory, terrain analysis, and criminal and animal behavior, and apply that to planning for where we would want to assign our canine resources. And I'll be using a fictional incident, and I'll be making all sorts of generalizations and simplifications. But the important point is to see, just see a picture of how all of these concepts might come together. So let's return to our first scenario now, where a hunter has stumbled onto a human cranium, and we now want to go back and see if more remains can be located. And this is, in fact, is a situation that we've run into a number of times for past evidence searches. In this case, as in many cases, our available clues are extremely limited. I mean, there's just not much to go on. We have found cranium, and we have a possible access route from roads from the east. As I said, there's not much to go on, but this is fairly typical. So let's start with a reasonable assumption that additional remains are most likely will be found closer to rather than farther away from where the cranium was found. And to reflect that, we've simply added range rings at 100-meter distances, just to help us think about that. All right. So those of you who took very careful notes during Module 1 will remember that we can characterize how probability density changes with distance from your initial planning point. And again, the way to think about that is the probability is more tightly packed in this smaller area right around the IPP. And a reasonable way to visualize this is simply by the darker red shading that we've shown here. So again, probability density is higher in this area. So let's just pause for a second to remember how we might systematically add assumptions about both criminal and animal behavior. And in each of these categories, you can see, for example, that there are general factors, such as distance from the road, and specific factors. You remember we talked about or speculated about suspect stamina and initiative, if we have information about a specific suspect. And that also applies to animal behavior. There are general considerations, and there might be specific considerations if we know if we can confirm what scavengers are involved. And as an aside, and that's possible to do if you can locate bones and get an expert to examine teeth marks. And let me pause here, and there's a question. I'm not very familiar with HRD. Can HRD canines distinguish human bones from other animal bones? Oh, this is an excellent question. And the answer to that is yes. It's an extremely important part of training HRD canine to have them learn, in fact, that when they're given the search for human remains command, whatever that is, they do not get rewarded for finding animal bones. And the jargon for this, I think, is So you proof them off animal bones. So they learn that animal bones aren't interesting, they don't get rewarded for it, but human remains are interesting and they do get rewarded for it. So it's a very important part of training, and it's a hard part of training as well. Okay, so let's see where we are. Okay, we look in general. Okay, so let's take a look, for example, at one of the general factors, distance from road, or in this case, distance from the road. Okay, on the next slide. And so here, we know where our roads are. So we've added some shaded buffers of higher probability alongside the roads in the area, as well as this pullout, okay? So again, as we start to build this picture, we can see that the likelihood of finding additional remains may not be distributed evenly across this entire area. Okay, it's starting to look like there's some areas that we're going to be more interested in than others. And if planners are going to make bets on where to assign our valuable and scarce HRD resources, we want them to be betting on these higher probability areas. So to this picture then, we've done our, remember we did our terrain analysis and saw this steep downhill. We can add just a sector that represents a higher probability of finding additional remains in a downhill area. Now, keep in mind that all of this is based on sort of generalized but reasonable assumptions, that our planning map is not going to tell us this is where you're going to find the remains, but it's simply indicating where, based on probability statements, there may be a higher likelihood of finding additional remains. Okay. So there's, at this point though, there's still more planning we can do. So now let's consider what we know about animal influences on human remains. This is our same search area, it's just with a different map background. Here's sort of the roads, okay? So if we have trackers doing scouting of the area, we would want them to find and map any animal trails in the area, and we're going to add those to our planning map, okay? These are the dotted dark blue lines here, okay? We also know that drainages can be natural travel paths for animals, so we want to make sure that the drainages as well are added to our planning map, and here we can see, in fact, that there's several drainages within reasonable proximity to the found cranium, okay? And then we can draw another integrated probability mosaic showing a variety of factors here. We've shown where the cranium was found and the distance rings from that position. We've mapped a downhill sector below that area, and we've mapped as higher probability areas or buffers the animal trails and the drainages. And I haven't shown here, but we would also include the road buffers as well, okay? And all of these features would want to receive special attention during our search planning, as well as our on-the-ground searching. So here's another view of that same probability mosaic, where we've represented probability using thermal coding, ranging from dark red, very high, through high to medium to low probability. And we can see here that we've got all of the factors represented: the road buffers, distance from IPP, here's the pullout buffer, excuse me. And we're also taking into account the animal trails and the drainages. So again, this is another way to represent sort of differential probability in a search area, and also makes for a pretty colorful wall decoration if you want to impress your friends. Another version of this is shown here. And at this point, and so this is a search area, and this actually is for an actual search. This was for sort of an unnamed evidence search in an unnamed county on an unnamed planet. But what we were able to do is plot all of the high probability areas and buffers based on both criminal behavior and animal behavior. And then we were able to, for example, provide search teams maps. We would provide a map like this and say, here's your search area, but notice these high probability features within that search area. If you're going to give anything more time, if you're going to invest any more time anywhere, these would be the areas where you'd want to invest your time. Again, helping us identify where to invest our dog's valuable nose. Now, a map like this stops at making a qualitative statement. It simply says, in these colored spaghetti areas, we think, based on criminal behavior and animal behavior, that probability is higher. It doesn't tell us necessarily how higher, how much higher, or what the aggregate composite score is. And it turns out that's possible, we think, but it's a heck of a lot more work. And I will just show you one example of moving in the direction of quantification. All right. So let's take a look at the example of thinking about probability of area as a function of distance from the road. Okay. And here, let's see, in this example, we have a road going through a flat area. And what we're going to do is to assume that there is a normal distribution or a bell-shaped distribution centered on the road. In other words, the farther we get from the road, the least likely it is to find remains. I'll come back and discuss a variant on that in a moment, but let's just use this as a specific example. Now, we know from historical data that about 95% of remains are found within about 150 yards of the road. So we can take what we know about the area under the normal curve without going into a lot of details, and that actually allows us to assign a percent probability score to area A, areas B, and area C based on the area under the normal curve. And so we could use those as POA scores for the buffer that's alongside this road. Okay. Now, is this the exact correct quantification model for this? The answer is we don't know, but at least we're making reasonable assumptions and we're being systematic. But you can see how this can get pretty complicated pretty fast. Now, the one variant on this, which is, I think, even more interesting, is where you consider that, you know, if I'm a criminal and if I want to hide a body off the road, you know, I don't want to leave it too close to the road, but I don't want to do the work of carrying it too far, in which case, if this is the center of the road, you might want to shift this whole normal distribution off to where it peaks somewhere out here and then readjust all of your numbers. But just another example of how this thinking can get a little bit complicated, especially when you want to come up with reasonable methods to quantify the POA. All right. So let's wrap things up in a couple of slides. So in this session, most of my focus has been on using what's known about criminal behavior in animal behavior and combining that with terrain analysis to make initial probability of area statements. But remember, we can use all of the components of search theory when searching for human remains. But this initial planning, again, can help guide us to be smarter about where we aim our canine noses. And so when we're called out on a search, I think all of us are thinking the same thing. I hope we get assigned to a good area. And by this, we usually mean no swamps, no blackberries, and a high chance of finding human remains. So, you know, I can't do anything about the swamps and the blackberries, but I hope what I've shown is that by combining search theory, historical data, terrain analysis, and what's known about criminal and animal behavior and how to take that and turn that into probability statements, that can help us assign our canine teams to the higher probability areas rather than just spreading canine teams uniformly throughout a very large search area. So someone says, don't forget about the black flies and mosquitoes. Yes, those are fun on assignments as well. Okay, so we'll close with the final poll of the session. If I can find the final poll, it's over here. And that final poll is coming right up. And launch polling. And you can see from this is one of these unbiased poll questions. And we'll wait while people sign in here on the poll. And oddly enough, the majority of our responders are agreeing that my dog's nose is a rare and special search resource. And I want to get it assigned to the areas of higher probability. Okay, good job. All right, we'll end the polling with that. Oh, I'm going to share the polling, share the results. Okay, those are the results. Okay. And that brings us to the end of our session. Thanks everybody for sticking through with us. So at this time, I'm just going to hang around. Did I share the results? Share the results, okay. We'll just hang around for some time and see if there are any questions. So here's a question. Is there a resource for further training, including practical exercises to take the learning further? Someone has commented, thank you very much. I feel much better prepared now to dispose of a body and not get caught. Okay, good. I'm really heartened to see how people are getting value out of this training. But back to the question, is there a resource source for further training? Nothing is immediately coming to mind. They may be out there, but I can't think of any at the moment. A small group of us are still working on refining the details and actually some extremely complex details of quantifying the criminal and animal probability statements. Because what you end up with is a map like, remember that really colorful mosaic I showed you guys? Let me back up to that. Where's my yeah, there. Okay, you end up with a map like this. And imagine that we found a smart way to actually quantify the probability within all of the red road buffers and quantify all of the probability in the stream side or drainage buffers and quantify the probability increases on the downhill sides of roads, and quantify the probability increases in areas of special interest, for example, such as around the initial found bones. The challenge, so that's a challenge in itself. I mean, it's complex enough to cross your eyes, but even if you get that far, then the real challenge, the real hard part is how the heck do you combine all of that quantification represented on the map so that you could, for example, say, well, here is a search segment. What is the relative probability within this search segment that gets contributed by these 3 high probability zones? That turns out to be an extremely complex trick, and we think actually requires high-powered graphical information systems. Okay, so let me see. I'm going to try to catch up on questions here. Are there plans for another set of seminars? I might repeat these at some point in the future, but nothing is scheduled at this point. And what software do we use? Everything you've seen tonight was created on Sartopo, which is our go-to mapping program. It's an excellent mapping program, provides all of those different base backgrounds that I showed you. Okay, I'll just hang around a little bit watching the chat to see if any other questions come up.